So, Susan Larson is a national and local treasure, literary treasure. She served on Pulitzer Committee along with Maureen Corrigan. She has a book out. It has been reissued. It's called Book Lover's Guide to New Orleans, and there might be some copies available out there. And she is the host of The Reading Life, which you can hear every week on our local NPR station, WWNO. And so everybody please welcome Susan Larson and her panel.
Oh, whenever you work on something like this, I just want you to know this is the reward. You get to put together a panel you want to be part of and you want to talk to. So I'm very honored to have these four with me. They are all such special, wonderful people. To my right is Maureen Corrigan, who teaches at Georgetown University. You all know her from Fresh Air, I'm sure. Maureen Corrigan is one of those critics in the United States who can still give the Corrigan bump to something and have it really matter. Today we're going to be talking about her books, Leave Me Alone, I'm Reading, Finding and Losing Myself in Books, and So We Read On, How the Great Gatsby Came to Be and Why It Endures. So those are wonderful, wonderful books. Next to her is Ann Gislason of NOCA. So we'd like to really thank all of you from NOCA today. And we know you have to leave a little early, but thanks for coming anyway. And Ann's book is one of my very favorite New Orleans books. It's called The Futilitarians, Our Year of Thinking, Drinking, Grieving, and Reading. I did notice reading came last in that title. And then next to her is Ann Boyd-Rue, who teaches at the University of New Orleans and who celebrated the 150th anniversary of Little Women with the book, Meg, Jo, Beth, and Amy, The Story of Little Women and Why It Still Matters. Love that book. And next to Ann, we have two Anns today, so that'll be fun. Yeah. Next to Ann is Sarah Weinman, who is, a lot of us know her in the book world from Publisher's Lunch and her work in publishing. She is an expert on women crime writers, and she is going to be talking about her book, The Real Lolita, the kidnapping of Sally Horner and the novel that scandalized the world. So welcome, Sarah. So we are four extraordinary book lovers, and I think book lovers love everything about books. They love the way they feel in your hands. They love the way they smell when you open them. They just love the object of books. And so it's inevitable that we would write about our love of books, I think. So I wanted everybody to talk a little bit about their first encounter with the book that mattered most to them for this panel. I mean, what was it like the first time you can't really do that, Anne, but you can pick one. You can pick Clarice Lispector, maybe. But talk a little bit about what it was like for you to read Lolita and find out about Sally Horner, the first time you read Little Women, Anne, which was surprising, you know, and for you, of course, The Great Gatsby. So take it away. Sarah, you want to go first?
Sure. So first of all, thank you all so much for coming to listen to us talk about books we love, argue with, commiserate over, deal with on a regular basis. It means the world. Lolita in particular is such a complicated, disturbing, thrilling, sui generis kind of novel. And when I first read it, I was 16. And I see that there are comparable aged people in the crowd. I'm not sure how I would feel if you all started to read Lolita for the first time at this point in your lives. But I know for me, I was a senior in high school and definitely on the precocious side. I'd been reading my whole life. Truthfully, if I had to choose between reading and writing, I'd probably still choose reading every time. It's impossible for me not to have my nose in a book. So with Lolita, I had come off reading various books. I'm from Canada originally, so our literature, what we consider, quote, canon, is a little bit different than what might be considered canon in the South or elsewhere in America. So the books and authors that I was gravitating more towards were like Margaret Atwood and Alice Munro and Margaret Lawrence. And so for a class module, I'd just come off reading One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And I think between that and some other books, I've encountered Lolita and thought, well, this is controversial and this looks interesting. I should give this a try. And upon reading it, aside from the subject matter, what really struck me is that Humbert Humbert, who narrates the book, was the first time that it really ever encountered and knew that I had encountered an unreliable narrator. And sensing that and comprehending that sort of opened me up to what literature could do. And so to fast forward about 2 decades or thereabouts, when I first stumbled across the story of Sally Horner while looking for essentially my next crime story to report out, I had read an essay written by a Nabokov scholar that linked her kidnapping in Camden, New Jersey in 1948 to actual line in Lolita and other textual references. And I asked myself, had anyone reported out Sally's story as a crime story? Were there people still alive who might remember her, who still knew her? Were there family members? Were there people who had encountered her during her 21-month cross-country nightmare? Were there court documents or official records or news reports that might still exist? Because this crime happened 70 years ago. This is not the easiest thing. It's not like everything is easily findable on the internet the way that things often are now. And so it required a lot of digging and a lot of shoe leather, I suppose, and a lot of cold calls, and also a lot of reading. Because I had to, while writing the book, I also not only needed to understand Sally Horner, but I set myself a really daunting task of trying to understand Vladimir Nabokov. And so what I can say is my hope was I wanted to make Sally Horner human alongside the fictional Dolores Hayes, who of course is referred to as Lolita. But I also wanted to grok what Nabokov was doing and make him a little more human and understand what it means when art for art's sake and what is underneath that and the real trauma and pain that is sort of underneath all that.
Okay, can you hear me okay? I don't have the biggest voice, I know. Is that okay? Okay, so I'm supposed to say probably that I read Little Women when I was 10, 11, something like that. I wish that I had, and I've met so many women since I started writing this book who did read it when they were young and for whom it had a really formative impact. The character of Jo in particular. I wish I had encountered Jo when I was that age. I think I could have really used her when I was young, but instead I was reading like Young Miss magazine instead of Little Women. I would have done better with Little Women. But I did first read Little Women when I was in graduate school. I was in my early 20s. I had a great professor who was in a course on American literary realism, taught Little Women right after Huck Finn. And it was a great pairing, and we of course talked about them as children's literature, but also as important American books. And I was having this kind of academic intellectual engagement with the book at the same time that I was having a real personal affection that was growing in me for this book, because even though it's supposed to be a little girl's book, it's really not. It's really, the second half in particular, it's a YA book, right? It's a book about growing up, and I was still growing up. I mean, you go to graduate school because you don't know what you want to do with your life, right? And that's exactly what I was doing. And I didn't know how I was going to be able to do all the things that I wanted to do. I wanted to grow up and write books, right? I wanted to maybe be a professor. I wanted to have a family, and it was scary trying to think about the possibility of combining all of those things. And here was Jo, who was, figuring it out too on the page. So Jo came at a really good time for me. And I have to say that the very end of the book, the revelation for me was when Jo, at the end of the book, she has gotten married, and she's had a successful early literary career. She's had some successes, but she marries Professor Bear, and they make a school together, and they have kids, and they've got all these boys running around because it's a boys' school. And they're looking back. The girls are all looking back and thinking about their castles in the air that they had when they were young. And Jo says, well, I look back now and see that my ambition to be a writer, it seems kind of cold and selfish to me now, but I still hope to write a great book someday. And when I do, it will be even better for these experiences that I'm having now. And that kind of blew me away. No one had ever said, you know, maybe you will write better books for having a family, right? It was always one or the other. There was always this fear that if you had a family, you weren't going to be able to write books. And here was just saying that maybe they would be better. And what I discovered actually writing this particular book was that is absolutely true, because my daughter, who's now 15, and she was 11 when I started writing the book, my experience of watching her grow up and learning about what it's like for a girl to grow up today totally enriched this book. So I couldn't agree with Joe more.
Everyone hear me okay? Oh, no? Swallowed. Is that better? Yes. Ooh, now that sounds really loud. Yeah. No? Okay. Yeah, I guess when you kind of qualified my answer to the question, I didn't have this kind of formative moment with one book where I thought, I must write about this. It's my book is kind of approached from a different way, and that I didn't actually pick any of the books that are written about. And the genesis of the book is that in the beginning of 2012, a friend approached me and asked if I would want to talk about some philosophy issues with him one-on-one. And I was making dinner. I just finished full, the afternoon of teaching, and I was like, no, it sounds exhausting. I don't want to do that. I said, but I would do it as a social venture if you wanted to open it up and do it as like a group. And so we talked about it a little more. He obviously needed some talking through of some issues, and he wanted to do it in a sort of intellectual, personal way. And we thought about a bunch of other friends, and it turned out there was kind of some need in our immediate community of friends. And so we started what we jokingly called the Existential Crisis Reading Group. And it was the first meeting occurred the day before Epiphany in January, the very beginning of the year of 2012. And we read Ecclesiastes and Epicurus because Chris, my friend who chose them, wanted to go way back to the ancient kind of thought around existentialism and dealing with things like the death and the void and life beyond our lived experience and the here and now and what we're doing here. And it was a fantastic evening. And we were all just like, well, we started this great thing. And literally the next week, my father, who had been ill, he died the next week. And so in terms of like starting an existential crisis reading group and then being confronted immediately, like within a week of, like the loss of a parent is one of the kind of the things that makes you kind of question your life and bigger issues in your life more than anything. And so we kept, with using kind of Epicurus and Ecclesiastes as sort of like the basis for it, we kept meeting for the entire year. And so the book is 12 chapters, 12 months, and I didn't choose one of those readings. It was all chosen by different people who were kind of working off of a responding to whatever reading we had done that month, someone would choose the next one. And so we read, like the next month, we read This Way for the Gas Ladies and Gentlemen by Tadeusz Borowski, the Polish writer, and we did Arthur Koestler. We ended with Clarice Lispector. We did a range of books the entire time. But like I said, I never chose any of them. But each one, as I read throughout the year, obviously I was in a state of grief and like working through grief, and so each one of those readings, I was kind of I kind of approached almost all of them with that mindset. And it occurred to me after the first reading and the first meeting that like everything happening all at once like that, I just kind of had to write about it. And so I wrote an essay, and then it kept happening month after month. Whatever I was reading, it was just reverberating throughout my life in a very intense way. Because when you're in a state, like if you're grieving, if you're in love, you're kind of in this very receptive way, like everything in your life is just kind of intensified and magnified. And the readings, that was happening with all of the readings too. They would just stick with me in a way that I'd never felt before. And part of it was also like having, each month I would have these really great conversations with people I really respected and loved, who would bring so much more to it. So in a way, like the book feels to me like this big collaboration. It wasn't me like doing a deep dive into like a text or one thing. It was kind of this, I never knew what was going to come next in terms of the reading. So that's kind of my short turkey.
Can you hear me? Okay. Like probably 99% of the audience in front of me, I read The Great Gatsby in high school, and I didn't like it. I mean, I don't even remember if I didn't. It just left no impression on me besides feeling like, what does this book about rich people behaving badly have to do with me? I went to high school in Astoria, Queens, which is part of the landscape of the novel. That's one of the places that Nick and Jay Gatsby and Daisy and everybody else drives through on their way to Manhattan. It's not the place you drive to, it's the place you drive through. And my dad was a refrigeration mechanic. I mean, we were blue collar. It just, not that I believe that literature has to mirror you, exactly for you to be able to enter into it. But at that time in my life, it really didn't seem as though Gatsby had anything to say to me. And then I went to grad school and I had to teach it. And when you have to teach a text, that's when you really have to confront it. And I read Gatsby then for the second time, and I was blown away. I was blown away by Nick Carraway's voice. I always think of his last name. He's the guy who's been carried away by love for his dead friend, Gatsby. And it's that voice of yearning, of regret, of reaching out for someone who will never be there again except in your memory and imagination. And that's when I really started to be drawn into the novel. I've read it over 100 times. I've gone to see Gats, the 7.5-hour production, in which the entire novel is recited on stage, and you must go. You must go. You will hear the humor in it, the zaniness. You will hear things in it that you just have missed. Even I have missed after all those readings by reading. For writing about the book about Gatsby, I wanted to try to figure out what Fitzgerald thought he was doing when he wrote Gatsby. And he was always saying that Gatsby was about aspiration. So I wanted to probe that some more. I wanted to figure out why the novel had disappeared by the time he died in 1940 at the age of 44. Of probably his third heart attack when he was living in Hollywood. And I wanted to find out how it came back so quickly, because it's not that unusual a story in American letters that our great writers are unknown and their work is forgotten by the time of their death. I think about Melville, Moby Dick was nowhere, Emily Dickinson, on and on, Zora Neale Hurston. But what is unusual about Fitzgerald's story is that by the end of the 40s, so not even 10 years after he had died, Gatsby is already being talked about as a great American novel. So it comes back very quickly. This novel that he couldn't even buy when he was alive and going into bookstores in Hollywood. People thought he was dead already at that point. I think probably my colleagues on this panel may have had the same experience. When you start on the detective work of going after a novel, a book, a writer who you love, funny things begin to happen. And so I did crazy things, crazy detective expeditions, like going out on the Long Island Sound to see East Egg and West Egg on the Great Gatsby book tour, a Great Gatsby boat tour, rather, of the Long Island Sound, which is a floating tourist trap. But and so there were crazy expeditions like that, but there were also moments of grace. I went back to my old high school, which was the scariest expedition, because I hadn't been back in almost 40 years, 40. And my old English teacher was still at the high school. Wow. She was obviously 2 when she was there. She's assistant principal, one of those amazing teachers who remembers everybody. And so I wanted to go back to where I first read Gatsby and to hear those students who were encountering Gatsby for the first time, to hear how they were reacting to the novel. And I swear to you, on the non-existent Bible on this table, I heard new things about Gatsby from them. I hear new things, I learn new things about Gatsby every time I talk about it in groups. Pretty much every time I reread it, I feel like I learned something new. And that, for me, is the mark of a great book. It's inexhaustible. It's still teaching, showing you things every time you read it.
Well, when you were on these expeditions, where did you find you felt closest to Fitzgerald or closest to the book?
I did, despite the tackiness of that boat tour, which was filled with people popping champagne bottles and saying, "Old sport, have another," it was horrible. That landscape is still there of East Egg and West Egg. And if you're far enough out, looking toward, if you're on West Egg and you're looking toward Long Island Sound, you can see Manhattan. So you think about those amazing paragraphs at the end of Gatsby, which people have said they're the greatest 7.5 pages that anybody has ever written about America. And that's when, Gatsby is dead, Nick is standing there looking at Long Island Sound, but also seeing Manhattan in the distance and talking about the fact that Gatsby's dreams were not commensurate to his capacity for wonder, and that in effect he should have been one of those Dutch sailors who saw the fresh green breast of the new land in front of his eyes, Manhattan Island and America. He should have been somebody who discovered a continent. That would have been equal, not Daisy Buchanan. So I felt Fitzgerald there, and I'll just quickly say, when I went down to South Carolina, University of South Carolina has a great collection of Fitzgerald papers and memorabilia. The librarian there, on the last day that I was in the library, said to me, "Do you want to hold Fitzgerald's briefcase?" And this was the briefcase that he carried in Hollywood. Those were not great years for him. He was struggling with alcoholism. He was treated terribly by the movie industry, as were all of our great writers. He was treated just like a hand. They would give him scripts to rewrite, and then he worked on Gone with the Wind for 2 weeks, and then he was pulled off. So I hold his briefcase, which is one of those battered leather briefcases people used to carry, and it has his name engraved in gold on the briefcase, and his address. And the address is 597 Fifth Avenue. That's the address of the Scribner's building, his publisher. That was Fitzgerald's only permanent address. He never owned a house. He lived in furnished apartments and rented houses. And by the time he was in Hollywood, he was, again, down on his luck. That was his home. I mean, in a way, that tells the story of a writer. That probably those of you young folks sitting there, you probably don't need to hear this. But, what he endured, knowingly or not, to be able to write his novels and short stories.
Have you seen his house here in New Orleans? Did you
I
drive
have
by?
not. No. Do you want to take me?
Yes.
Okay.
It's on Britannia Street,
okay.
and there's a legendary story that he once drove from here to Birmingham with a pitcher full of Sazeracs for Zelda. So he lived New Orleans in the New Orleans style, which
I am not surprised.
So, Anne, talk a little bit about your journey to find Louisa May Alcott. And there were some wonderful adventures you had and moments when you felt very close to her.
Right. I mean, you can't get any closer to her than Orchard House in Concord, Massachusetts, and actually going into the home and seeing the little desk where she wrote Little Women. And I'd seen it before. I wrote about Alcott in my dissertation, and so I'd done a ton of research, 20 years ago when I was working on that, 20 plus years. And, but going back this time was pretty amazing. I've been through the house a number of times. You're always in a group, right? You're always with a lot of people. And this time I was there with my mother and my daughter, which was really special, to share this with them. And my book was just coming out. So this is actually but still, it's a cool story. But anyway, we walked up, we're in this big group, and we're walking up the staircase to go up to the, second floor, and my daughter and I were ahead of everyone else. So when we walked into Louise's room, it was empty, and it was just the two of us. And boy, the tears just started welling. I just couldn't, it was just an amazing moment to be there alone with my daughter in this room with Louisa's spirit, because you really feel it in the house, and you really feel it in this room. The wonderful thing about Orchard House is that it was the first literary home preserved in America that people could visit. And they have all of their things, and you can see on the walls where May, Amy in the book, drew on the walls and did all kinds of, art that she was doing. And so their presence is very much there in the house. So that was just seeing where she wrote the book. I mean, you can't get any better than that. But just, I would say, second best is down the road at the Concord Public Library in the manuscript divisions down in the basement. They have manuscripts, Louisa May Alcott's manuscripts. Little chapters that have survived of various books. And it's just amazing to hold them, right? To see the pages, to see her loopy, crazy handwriting. It gets really slanty because she wrote so much. She had to teach herself to write with her left hand as well. So you can see when she starts, slanting the other direction. But it's, what's really remarkable is they have 2 chapters in manuscript of Little Women. And she had written on the outside, saved at mother's request. So these, the practice would have been to just, throw them in the fire as soon as you didn't need them anymore. But these were saved. And when she first wrote Little Women, I should say, these are from the 2nd volume. So Little Women's actually 2 books. It was published part 1 in September 1868, 150 years ago. And the 2nd volume was published in April 1869. And in between, she was getting letters from girls wanting to know, who the girls marry. She said, as if that were the only end and aim of a woman's life. She's a little disgruntled. But basically, when she wrote the first part, she had no idea what a huge success it was going to be. So there aren't any chapters in manuscript from the first part. But it was such a big hit, and the kids wanted a sequel. And the second part, she saved 2 chapters that apparently were her mother's favorites. And they are the chapter where Laurie proposes to Joe and she turns him down, Heartache, it's called. And the other one is A Foreign Correspondent. And those are letters that Amy's writing home when she's in Europe to her family. And those experiences are actually based on Louisa's own experience when she was traveling in Europe. And the really shocking thing, though, is to see the changes that she made, because the assumption has always been among Alcott scholars that she just dashed off these manuscripts because she wrote them really quickly, and that there was no revision of any kind. Well, the Amy chapter shows a ton of revision. The Joe and Laurie chapter shows a little bit of revision, but a really interesting line that she strikes out. So right after Laurie has proposed to her, and Joe keeps saying, no, when are you going to understand? I really don't want to marry you. I know this is hard, but I'm saying no. And she's trying to be firm with him. In the manuscript, Alcott wrote, Laurie grabbed her and kissed her violently. I'm just sitting there reading this going, what? What? He doesn't, she struck it out. And in fact, this does not appear in the book. Although if you've seen the 94 movie, Christian Bale kisses Winona Ryder, so maybe it's not a huge surprise. But it wasn't there in the book. It wasn't there in the book.
So Sarah, your path was like the true detective. You were really on the trail of Sally Horner. And her life was short.
Too short.
Yes.
I mean, so her kidnapping took place when she was 11. She had first encountered Frank LaSalle, the 50-year-old mechanic or thereabouts. His age is a little bit in question, in part because his entire life is a little bit in question. I was able to the best of my knowledge, figure out that he used upwards of 20 aliases. He was a common career criminal and an opportunistic child molester. And so he encountered Sally when she was 11 at this Five and Dime in Camden, and through various machinations over the course of a few months, spirits her away for what she thinks is a week in Atlantic City, New Jersey, and then that turns into a 21-month trip that goes from Atlantic City to Baltimore to Dallas to San Jose, California, where she's ultimately rescued. And she only lives another 2.5 years after coming home to Camden. And sorry about that. I thought it was a little bit soft there. After Sally returns to Camden, she only lives another 2.5 years, and she dies in a car accident on her way back from a vacation in Wildwood, New Jersey. And so what I had to figure out was to piece together Sally's life, her brief tragic life, based on what material I could find. And so, as I mentioned before, there were people who were still alive to remember her. There were a couple of conversations that I had with Sally's best friend in the last year of her life, a woman whose maiden name was Carol Starts. And she really gave me some incredible insight into what it was like for Sally to be a teenage girl coming home after her kidnapping and her ordeal is subject to incredible media scrutiny, stories that were printed in newspapers, not just across the country, but across the Atlantic, in papers as far-flung as Australia and New Zealand. I mean, this was a major story in March of 1950, which was the time she was rescued. And so to really get a sense of what it was like for her, 14, 15, when she's back in the same hometown, back among the same students and the same environment, and everyone knows the worst thing that's happened to you and thinks it's something completely different. The worst thing that happened to Sally Horner is that she was the victim of repeated sexual abuse on the road. But what it was interpreted is that she willingly gave up her virginity to an older man and thus deemed a slut. And so that's the environment that she was living in. And it really didn't impress upon me until I talked to Carol. So not only did I have to kind of trace Sally's psychological journey, I wanted to go to as many places as I could where she had physically been, even though most of those places have transformed considerably in the 65 to 70 years that this, as long ago as the story took place. So when I went to Camden, obviously the Camden of 1948 is not the Camden of 2018 or 2019. The East Baltimore neighborhood where Sally lived and went to Catholic school is definitely not the East Baltimore neighborhood of now. And so it goes for the Oak Cliff neighborhood of Dallas, and even the part just outside of San Jose where there were trailer parks, which those have long since disappeared. But what I felt is that just putting myself physically in those environments, it was the same thing in Wildwood, which is where she spent her last weekend on the boardwalk, just walking the boardwalk, first by day and then by night. I just wanted some physical sense of what Sally might have been thinking, what she might have been feeling. And even though it wasn't as if I could prove everything, just having that speculative sense could ground me in the facts that I was able to uncover when I would look at court documents or FBI files or newspaper reports and the like. And then just very quickly, in addition, I also had to do quite a lot of research into what Vladimir Nabokov was up to, and two archives in particular, the Library of Congress in DC and the Berg collection at the New York Public Library jointly have almost all of Nabokov's material. So to be able to be amongst not only his papers, but the 94 note cards that are all that exist of what became Lolita, and one note card in particular where he writes the name Sally Horner. There was nothing quite like reading that and seeing that connection on essentially on the printed page.
Wow. So there is something about a book that means so much to you that makes you want to get out of the book, you know, go be where the book was. It's a really exciting kind of journey. And that was true for your group, Anne. And I think of that that Stations of the Cross chapter, when I love that chapter so much. I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about that ritual for your group.
Sure. Actually, last night we had a ECRG meeting, and we read Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler. It was so fantastic. That's one we've got to do in class at some point. And we did the drawing of the Stations of the Crisis, and that's kind of it's the ritual thing. It's always the month before Easter, and it came about spontaneously during that first year. We realized we were planning out at the end of the meeting, and these can be very long meetings. And towards the end, we were trying to find a date for the next meeting, and someone pointed out that the last Thursday of the following month was actually Holy Thursday. And so we were kind of joking about we should have like the Last Supper instead of the Last Supper, or and someone said Stations of the Crisis instead of Stations of the Cross, do Stations of the Crisis. And so we're like, yeah, let's do it. And so we just drew numbers. I just cut up a piece of paper with numbers 1 through 14. And this is a very Catholic town, and people actually still do Stations of the Cross around town on Good Friday, not on Holy Thursday, but we fudged that a little bit. And we decided that everybody would just kind of randomly choose. Nobody would know which station that they got. And basically, it's the Passion of Christ. It goes from when he was condemned to death. 14 stations, like Jesus, he's condemned to death by Pontius Pilate. He falls for the first time. Simon of Cyrene takes up his cross. He meets his mother, and so there are all of these stations of his suffering. It ends with him dying and being put in the tomb, and one of the sort of the stories behind the stations was that it was something that Mary did in order to mourn Jesus after he died, and it was kind of a mother's gesture of mourning a child, which was actually walking in his footsteps, and kind of going through all of the ordeals and things that he did, and pausing at every single fall, every single meeting, every single indignity, the moment of his death, and just reliving that by physically walking through it. And so we said, okay, and that's something that's done a lot in churches and in some cemeteries around New Orleans. And so we said we would just do one in Bywater. And so we all drew ones, and people, and we decided to have boundaries between Press Street and the Industrial Canal and the river and St. Claude. But you would just randomly choose a place, and just choose a reading or something that sort of reflected what your interpretation of that one was. And so some people did original things that they wrote. Some people made art and left it places, and would just kind of talk about what like, for example, one of the people in a group has a sort of strained relationship with her mother, and she brought a passage from Vivian Gornick's Fierce Attachments, and read that. But she brought us to a park, and it was a dark, children's playground. And so we're in this like dark playground, and she's talking about her relationship with her mother, and how this is where she comes with her friends who are mothers and kind of watches them interact with their children. And so it was this very kind of visceral, interactive thing where we're walking and reading and talking, and and having some drinks along the way too. And sometimes it can take. And last night we drew the station, since it's next month, and I mean sometimes these can go on for like 8 hours still, because no one knows where the next one is, and so we're like taking these long walks. So we'll be walking for like an hour before we get to the next one, but that's sort of kind of what it's about, like this, not the suffering, but kind of the hardships and the not knowing what's going to be coming next along the way. So, so that's Stations of the Crisis.
I love that. I love that ritual. I thought about you when I read the Man Booker Prize winner, Milkman, because the main character is always walking while reading.
I do
Reading
that all
while
the
walking.
time.
I do. No. It's a dangerous thing,
No,
but
and then
we should
people will
perfect it.
constantly be like, is that a good book? And it's like, I'm reading. Why are you talking to me? I'm trying to read.
Leave me alone, I'm
Exactly.
reading, Maureen. So let's talk a little bit about that book, because the reading memoir is a really popular form now, and it's so appealing to all of us who love books. And so talk a little bit for me, Maureen, about what it was like for you to look at the books of your youth again and to discover those patterns in your own reading.
Good question. I'll keep it brief. First of all, the title, by the way, comes from something my mother would keep saying to me. Put that book down, you're going to get bumps on your head from reading too much, you're going to ruin your eyes. My mother was the great anti-reader, so I would always be saying, leave me alone, I'm reading. the book was lovingly dedicated to her in some ways. So I did want to go back and think about books that had been really important to me, and the earliest excavations were certainly Nancy Drew, who I think I started reading Nancy when I was 8, and again, this world that on the surface had nothing to do with my world in blue-collar Queens. I mean, there were Nancy and her friends driving around Riverside Heights in Nancy's blue roadster and stopping at tea places for luncheon. But what a great fantasy about autonomy and about somehow gaining the respect of the adult world as a young woman. And also being able to set the world to rights as a detective, a female detective. So all of that kind of opened itself up to me more as I was going back and rereading those Nancy Drew novels. But the earliest layer, I went to Catholic school, and we read what I now consider to be secular saint stories, secular martyr stories a lot in Catholic school. And these were works of fiction and nonfiction that all had the same message: suck it up, suck it up, and don't complain, suck it up. So I'll throw out titles that there were the Karen books.
I read those.
You read
Yes.
those? There were memoirs, a couple of memoirs written by Marie, Kililia, about her daughter Karen, who had cerebral palsy in the early 50s. And there weren't a lot of resources around then. But I vividly remember and talk about in my book one of the scenes that I'm sure we focused on in parochial school, which was Karen was asking one of her friends to get her something when they were playing, and she said, "You have to get it for me because I'm crippled." And Marie, the mother, overheard this. And she writes in her memoir, "I didn't think, I just acted. I slapped Karen and told her, none of this ever." That was the message. That was the message of Tom Dooley's memoirs. Dr. Tom Dooley, who worked in Vietnam and field hospitals there, terrible conditions. Don't complain. That was the message of the Beanie Malone series about a large family of Irish Catholics in Denver, sort of around World War II. Don't complain. I love these books. and when you go back and you read those childhood books, I read Little Women, but I was also really interested to read the books that weren't, top flight literature, but somehow stayed with me. You realize how much of your outlook, your judgments about the world and people have been shaded, at least, by these early messages about how one should behave in the world.
Well, I have to say that I too love Nancy Drew, and it kind of shocks me that the one I remember most is The Haunted Showboat, which is, I will tell all of you New Orleanians, the worst Mardi Gras book ever written, ever. So, enough of that. But for you, for Ann Gisselson, for you, the process of writing your reading memoir was different because you're writing about reading in concert with other people. And all of you are dealing with such stressful times. I mean, we can all remember those post-Katrina years when things were fresh and damaged and scary. And so talk a little bit about that, about what it meant to draw in the other readers into your story.
Yeah, like I said previously, the book really feels more like a collaboration. And I almost feel a little guilty, like when I'm out, if I'm doing a reading or something, and maybe like half of what I'll be reading, if I'm talking about what's going on with the group, will be quotes that my friends, like things that my friends were saying about it. And so I think it gives it a really dynamic quality to it, because I don't feel like, it certainly makes me think way more about the work. That's one of the things I love about, to go back to my NOCA job, is that, I might teach certain things over and over again, but every time we read it, all of the different minds and the different lived experiences in the room contribute to that moment. And so I think with every chapter, there were kind of two parts to it. There was you read something, reading is a deeply kind of personal, intimate, solitary thing. It's your mind on the page, and it's the writer's mind on the page, and it's just like kind of this very intimate communion that happens, that you do by yourself. And then you go into the group, and that same thing has happened with 10 other people, and then everybody brings that together, and then it's a completely different experience because last night was great talking about this this dystopian book by Octavia Butler, and just hearing all of these really disparate views of what she was putting out there in terms of the future and hope for humanity and all of that. And so there was that part of it that I was kind of processing what everybody else was saying. And I also feel very guilty because people are like, how can you remember so much from these meetings? And frankly, it was my sister, Susan, who was also in the group, and she was taking awesome notes. She took like great notes. She's like a note taker. And I'm not a really good note taker because I was like the hostess. I was like going to get more cheese and, just like trying to put the kids to sleep and trying to like manage everything that was going on and listening. But she was taking these great notes. And so at the end of the year when I decided to do it, to write the book, I was like, Susan, do you mind if I have that notebook? Like, is that what you were saying? Idea close. And so she took great notes. And so she had like actual quotes by people that I could use. And so I'm really indebted to her for that too. So there was that part of it of kind of trying to get the conversation and all of the disparate, people disagreeing about things. And there were a lot of disagreements. And people like bringing their personal selves into the discussion. There's that part, but then there was the part that I would go back and when I was doing the writing of the book, where I would like read, that great biography by Benjamin Moser by Clarice Lispector, and I would do like a bunch of research on whatever it was whatever writer we were doing at the time, and so some of those chapters are informed by the spontaneous discussion, but then it's also informed by me doing a lot of like critical reading and research about the writer to kind of to flesh that out some more. So I come across as being like way smarter and more informed than in the book. My brother's like, God, it's like like all these quotes about these writers and stuff. I'm like, John, I like I read it and then I like write the quote down and I put it into the book. It's not like I just spontaneously know all of these things. Yeah. So it's a combination of of memory of the recorded conversation and then me doing a considerable amount of research and considering those books and then trying to weave it all together.
So how did the other members of the Existential Crisis Reading Group think of the book?
Well, it's funny. I've gotten so many different reactions. Everybody asked everyone's permission before I even started doing it, and everyone said, fine, no problem. I asked if anybody wanted their names changed. No. I let everybody see the parts that they were in so they would feel okay about it because there was some personal stuff in there too. And I got everyone was fine with it, but then like later, I hear that somebody wasn't actually fine with it and, got kind of offended about something that I'd written but didn't want to tell me, and so I felt very bad about that. I think the funniest was that someone actually thought that that I rendered him in too nice of a way, that he's not actually that good and smart and nice, that it was too flattering of a portrait of him. So that was, I think, the funniest.
Oh, well, it's so interesting to me because I think about this a lot, and I think that reading is one of the last great private acts we have, where so much of our lives are lived online. And, this is one thing we can choose for ourselves. We can pick the book and fall in love with it, and it can all happen in this delicious solitude. And yet, I find that when we write about books, we often tend to just spill our guts on the page, which fascinates me because I look back on the things that I've written for the newspaper, for example, in all those years. And so much of my life is in those pages. My son learning to read, the kids' summer reading list, my husband getting ill, and just all kinds of things like that. And it was as if books had given me a language to speak the truth about my own experience. And so I'm curious how you found that in your writing, because it is a very personal thing, and you're laying it all out there when you talk about what you read and how you read it and what you think about it. So who wants to start? Sarah, you want to start?
I'll take that in a slightly different direction because
Okay.
my book was, that I envisioned it, was trying to do two things. It was trying to reconstruct and retell the story of Sally Horner, and also in parallel describe the creation, the writing, the publication, and cultural afterlife of Lolita, and how Sally's story helped inform that creation and the completion of the manuscript, and why it was really important that her story stand alongside that of Lolita. But when I turned in the first draft of the manuscript, which I had written in almost entire isolation, I didn't let my editors look at any of it, in part because for a variety of reasons I was writing it out of order, because it was dependent on where I was and what I was researching and what I was reporting and who I was talking to and what material was available to me. So it felt like piecing together this mosaic, which didn't make sense, and I couldn't present it until it was at least in a complete draft form. So in September of 17, that's when I emailed my editors and I was like, okay, you can finally read something I've written. And then the real work began. And
So into it, I committed suicide, and it was something that had, like, something that kind of came up a little bit throughout the book, and she's like, you're not really talking about this, and I said, yeah, I said, my father had sort of like forbade me to write about it before he died. He's like, I'll take it to my grave if you write about this, nothing good could ever come about through their deaths, and so as I was. After I had this conversation with and she's like, there's this thing that's missing. I said, well, that's, I had this kind of like this moratorium, but like it's also self-imposed thing about writing about them. And then as soon as she's like, well, why don't you try? That's obviously something. She said, it's like straining at the book, like trying to get out. And so then when I went and I revisited all of these chapters, like it was there the whole time. It was like, it was there in every reading. It was there like in every discussion, it was just like, it was just always there. And so I was like, oh God, like, do I have to do this thing? And so then I went through, and it was like, it made it like a way better book, a way deeper book. And like, and it was the vehicle, like kind of the group and the way that the book was structured with these, 12 readings and 12 months. There's a beginning, there's an end, there's all these like concrete readings, that I can kind of use as springboards, and that I had all along been using to kind of process this other grief, because when you lose somebody, that kind of opens up all the other grief and death in a family and all of that. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of like what I had been kind of writing circles around and not directly addressing. So it was difficult, but obviously it's what the book needed, and I'm glad that the vehicle provided me a way to do that felt in a way sort of safe.
Mm-hmm. All right, Chris, who is very strict, says it's time for Q&A. So if you have any questions, ask them. Otherwise, I have others. All right.
Oh, The Parable of the Sower. It's the first one of her Earthseed trilogy, which she never finished because she died. But now I totally want to read the second one. But it was so prescient and so scary reading it. It's about, the ecological, she was writing about the ecological and economic collapse of the country back in like the early 90s, and reading it now, and there's even a presidential candidate who's got the slogan, Make America Great Again. And she wrote this it was published in 1993, and some of the things that this world, it's a very bleak world, but the kind of the spiritual core that runs throughout it, it's a young African-American narrator, it's incredible. Oh, sorry. Parable of the Sower. Sower. Yeah, Parable of the Sower. Yeah.
Anybody else? David.
Sarah, I'm curious. You said you went on the entire trail of this kidnapping. You followed the exact route?
I mean, I didn't go in a linear fashion. So this book grew out of a magazine article, and so for that article I went to Camden and I went to Baltimore, and I did not go elsewhere because I had a deadline. But then when I sold the proposal and started on the contract, then I went back to Baltimore and I went back to Camden. I went to Atlantic City in the company of a friend who's also a journalist, and which it was eventually published on Vulture, which is New York Magazine's website. And that was amazing because I did not expect to find the house where Sally and Frank LaSalle lived those weeks in Atlantic City. I knew the address, and I just figured it was so long ago it had probably been torn down the same way as other places, and there it was. And I don't want to say that it looks exactly the way that it did in 48, but I don't think a lot has been done renovation-wise to it. So, and I did go to Dallas for book tour, and in fact, I just did an event there a few weeks ago, and so I was able to more or less see the neighborhood and the place where Sally was, but because I knew that what were trailer parks had long since been torn down, I didn't feel as much of a need to visit it in the flesh until a little bit later on. So I did make my way across that journey.
And were you able to get into the court documents and the arrest records and all that as well?
Where they existed or were able to be found, I did. I remember there was one day when I was in Philadelphia doing some related research, and I took a train that connects into Camden because it's right across the river. It was a horrendously rainy day, and I was getting frustrated because there was one court clerk who had been back and forth on the phone, and he was sort of stonewalling me, and I thought, why don't I just go from courthouse to courthouse and just ask in person? And ultimately, the answer that I got, there was one court file in particular I really wanted, and the best guess is that it's somewhere in the basement of the courthouse, but nobody has access to the key because it's so old. And at that point, I just was like, oh, can I just go there in person and like break it open? And they're like, no, you can't do that. Yeah. Yeah.
I just reread Reading Lolita in Tehran. And that was, I read that first 10 years ago, 15 years ago. That was the first time I read Lolita. And I had read Gatsby in high school. And the Reading Lolita in Tehran gave me a total new take on Gatsby. And was, of course, the first time, not of course, but anyway, was the first time that I had read Lolita. You mentioned at the very beginning that you had, or were trying to get inside of the Nabokov cat.
Which is quite a daunting task, and one I really shied away from because he's a.
Where did you get to with that?
This also came together really in edits, and after some really long conversations with my editors, what we arrived at structurally is that anytime Sally Horner was in a particular place or where her narrative took her, I then had to mirror it to what was Nabokov up to at any given point. And so it did help that there are some really amazing books published on Nabokov that I could rely on, in particular Brian Boyd's two-part biography that came out in the early 90s, and Stacy Schiff's biography of his wife Vera, which came out in the late 90s. And I also talked to Stacy a little bit just to kind of get some greater context on Vera and why she would have thought certain things, and also what, not to necessarily read too much into the way that she thought about things. But Stacy Schiff's biography is a brilliant example of conjuring up a life when that person really tried hard to stay out of the narrative. Mm-hmm. And so it seems as if there's very little available, and yet there's so much available, because if you just sort of read between the lines and look at the crevices, you can see a lot that's there, even if it seems like it's hiding in plain sight. And so much related to Lolita is hiding in plain sight. And so taking that ethos and then applying it to, well, what was Nabokov up to, and where was he traveling to, because he also traveled across the country hunting for butterflies on his summer breaks from Cornell and earlier Wellesley. So if I could just take what was in the record, bolster it with my own primary research, and try to tell it in as, I suppose, as entertaining and informative a way as possible, then even if my ability to conjure up a more human Nabokov could only get me so far, it was a lot further than I ever thought I could do.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Yeah.
Did you see Great Gatsby and The Side of Paradise and the short stories and any of the previous novels? Did you see the development?
Oh, yeah. I could see the development. The question is, did I see the development of The Great Gatsby in Fitzgerald's first novel, The Side of Paradise, 1920? We just passed the anniversary of the publication of that novel, and in March of this year, and his short stories. I did, of course, see the traces of Gatsby in, kind of looking toward Gatsby in those earlier writings. There's also a short story, especially called Absolution, which is all we have left of what's called the Gatsby, which Fitzgerald was writing, planning a novel set in the Midwest that he said was a Catholic novel. And this short story, Absolution, is about a priest who's having a nervous breakdown, a young boy who's kind of making a confession to him. And at one point, the priest says to the young boy, "Have you ever been to a carnival? Well, you've got to go, but don't get too close. Because when you get too close to all the beautiful lights, all you see is the sweat on people's faces. You sort of see the ugliness." And if you think of the book jacket of The Great Gatsby, which people rightly say is the most famous book jacket in American literature, that disembodied face of the flapper floating over a Coney Island landscape, that's it. I mean, the amazing thing is that the illustrator who designed that book jacket, Francisco Cugat, who was the band leader Xavier Cugat's brother, had no way of knowing about that story. So there's all sorts of things. But what I want to get to is, yes, I saw intimations of Gatsby in all of those earlier writings that I mentioned. There's nothing like Gatsby. There's nothing like Gatsby. I mean, I'm just saying Gatsby is different. It's different in kind, and it's different in the degree of genius. So I think Fitzgerald wrote many great short stories. I think he wrote great autobiographical essays in The Crack-Up. His letters, if you read his letters, you can't do anything for the rest of the day. He's so present in his letters. But I think he only wrote one great novel, and that's Gatsby. You can argue with me.
Oh, thank you all so much for coming.